So how do you apply fragrance? What is the ideal method by which you can apply fragrance either on your skin or clothing or whatever? I know as of late there's been a bit of debate or perhaps even controversy on this topic. Through a series of personal anecdotes, I hope to give you my interpretation and my impression on it, especially coming from somebody who, yes, people do acknowledge my perfume on me in public. I do receive compliments from time to time. So I'm going to be letting you know about my experiences and what my tips, tricks, and recommendations are in just a little bit. So make sure to stay tuned. Now, before I begin today's episode and I tell you how I personally apply fragrance, how do I spray it on skin, how do I spray it on clothing or whatever other body part, and how do I make it work for me so that I can enjoy my fragrance throughout the day, I want to start the video off first by saying that if you're a fan of fragrance-related content and simply if you love smelling your best, hit subscribe, hit the bell, and also give this video a thumbs up for the YouTube algorithm. It would really mean a lot to me. So, how do you apply fragrance? Well, you just spray it on. That's the easy answer that I can give to anybody. But of course, there ought to be a rhyme and a reason for you spraying it on. And I think it all boils down to, what are your expectations? Are you trying to get people to smell you? Are you doing it for yourself? Are you doing it so that you can accessorize with the clothing that you wear? But of course, there are some steadfast, tried and true rules that I think people should more or less abide by. So let's go ahead and start with this one personal anecdote, and I'm going back to this coworker that I had many years ago. And there's this one fragrance that he wore religiously, and he would always ask me if I could smell him, and my answer was always no. And the reason for that is because he always did one spray on the chest, and then he would put on his shirt, and then he would put on a sweater, and then whatever else. I guess his philosophy or his mindset behind that was, well, you know, fragrances are expensive, so I don't want to run out of it. But you are running out of it little by little because nobody can ever smell it on you, right? So for me personally, my first recommendation on how to apply fragrance is just make sure you're spraying enough. How many sprays you should do? Well, that's going to be contingent upon the brand. You also have to look at the concentration. If it's going to be something like an eau de cologne or an eau de toilette, just know that you can more or less afford to do more sprays. If it's something like an extrait de parfum, then you might get away with maybe 4 or even 3 sprays, also depending on the compositional nature of the fragrance. So if it's more base heavy, if it has a lot of fixatives, a lot of base notes, whether it be woods or resins or balsams, same thing, or vanilla, patchouli, green ingredients like vetiver, fir balsam, oak moss, the list goes on and on. If it possesses those ingredients, then you're like, okay, this is gonna linger on skin for a long time. I don't need to overdo it. However, if it's gonna be something very citrus heavy, you know, bergamot, neroli, petitgrain, yuzu, lemon, orange, pomelo, grapefruit, so on and so forth, okay, you can afford to do a little bit more, knowing that those ingredients are quite ethereal and they're going to evaporate and they're not going to linger for a very long time. So again, you have to look at these things. So that's number one, make sure you're spraying enough. Number two, know where to spray. So of course, everybody is familiar with the concept, or I think by this point, most of us should be familiar with the concept of pulse points. So of course, when we're talking about pulse points, it's where the veins sit closest to the skin. And of course, that current of blood is going to generate heat, and heat is what allows the fragrance to evaporate off your skin. So of course, if you're checking to see if somebody is alive or not, you're going to check their pulse points. So usually it's the side of the neck or it's the wrist, right? So this is why people ideally do one spray on each side. Now, of course, people also do the back of the head to create a sillage. So a sillage is the scent trail. So in other words, if you ever see a ship traveling in the water and you see that white streak of foam that it leaves behind it, that's called a sillage. It's a French word. And of course, we do the same thing with fragrance. If we spray it on the back of our neck, the nape of our neck, as we're walking, we're going to leave the scent trail behind us. So ideally, you want to spray the back of the neck. You want to do each side of the neck. And then you also want to do, I typically do one on each wrist, or if it's a heavier fragrance, you can do one on the wrist and then just lightly dab. So you don't have to vehemently rub it in, right, with force and whatnot, because that's going to quote unquote bruise the molecules. So you want to just dab it lightly so that it gets on both wrists and you're good to go. Now, if you gesticulate quite a bit, right, if you use your arms a lot, then people are more likely to smell the fragrance on you because, well, you're going to be wafting the scent in their direction with every hand gesture that you perform. And also, if somebody is in proximity of you, depending on how strong the fragrance is, they're going to smell it on you that way as well. Now, trick number 3, or the third tip that I would impart upon you, is spray it on your clothing. Be very careful though. You need to be leery of the fact that there are some fragrances that have very dark liquid. Some fragrances also have artificial coloring in the liquid as well. So if you're wearing a starched white shirt like this, you don't want to spray it with some dark ambery colored liquid because it's not going to come off and you basically just destroyed the shirt. It's actually something that happened to me yesterday. I'd rather not talk about it. But why is this important? Because, well, we're not cadavers, right? So we're generating heat all the time. However, if you spray it on something like your shirt, it's going to stay on your shirt for a much longer time. Right? So you want to make sure that, yes, you are spraying a little bit on clothing for as long as you have the ability to afford to do so, as long as the liquid isn't dark, and that helps quite a bit. You also need to be mindful of the fact that fragrance rises, right? So whatever you spray is going to eventually make its way up into the ether, which is why I've even heard of people who like to spray, believe it or not, below the waist, right? Like on the inside of their knees, which is also, you know, where the veins kind of sit close to. And whatever you spray down there is going to elevate, it's going to rise. Another thing too is that when people overdo the neck, they will stop smelling the fragrance after a while because they become anosmic to it. It's something called olfactory fatigue. So our senses deal with so much stimuli on a day-to-day basis, hour-to-hour basis, minute-by-minute basis. So if your body has sent that signal to your brain that says, okay, this is not something that I should be paying attention to anymore, this is not a threat, this is not a subject of concern, your nose will begin to tune it out after a while. So even though you're like, oh, I can't smell the fragrance on me, other people will still be able to smell the fragrance on you. And that has happened to me all the time, where I become nose blind to something and I'm like, wow, the longevity on this really stinks. And then like 7 hours later, somebody's like, oh, you smell good, or what are you wearing? And I'm like, really? You can smell that? So it's just a case of being nose blind or having olfactory fatigue. So don't be too discouraged by it. Trick number 4, or tip number 4 that I would give you is, as long as you have hair, spray it in your hair. Now, the reason for this is because your hair and the follicles in your hair and so on and so forth, they produce natural oil. And oil will actually capture the molecules and it will allow the fragrance to last longer, right? It's the same premise or concept behind various moisturization techniques. So for example, if they say, okay, just apply unscented lotion and then spray the fragrance on top of it, yes, that is going to contribute to the longevity of the fragrance. Spraying it in your hair is going to do the same exact thing. So just make sure that you spray it in your hair, and it will actually linger longer than it would if you sprayed it on your skin. Another thing you need to be mindful of, I don't know if you want to call this trick or tip number 5, is you want to try to avoid spraying high contact areas. So here's the thing, whenever I test fragrances, I love spraying it on the back of my hand, right? Because it's so easy to just do that, right? As opposed to smelling the inside of your elbow or whatever, or any other body part that is covered by an article of clothing. The only issue is that I wash my hands 10 times a day. So when I spray it, I might be able to experience it for like the next 45 minutes or hour or so until I end up washing my hands again. So again, trying to avoid spraying high contact areas, especially if you know that you're not going to be able to reapply if you're spraying it on at home and then you're going to leave the house for an extended period of time. Now, another thing that you can do in terms of the application of fragrance is just make yourself a decant. If you personally feel as though, you know, I've applied it in all of the right places, I applied the right amount, I did a little bit on clothing, I did in my hair, so on and so forth, but I still can't smell it, bring the bottle with you if it's small enough, or make yourself a decant. This way, right around lunchtime, you can do a second round of application and you can go back to that initial smell of the fragrance. And so, you know, it all boils down to what scenario are you going to find yourself in. If you're working from home, why don't you do 20 sprays? Who cares at that point, right? If you're going to be around a lot of other people and you are of a more sympathetic mindset where you feel like, I don't want to overwhelm anybody, this is a very dark, woodsy, smoky, balsamic fragrance, all right, I would totally understand if you decide to do only 4 or 5 sprays, but ultimately you need to apply the way that makes you happy. And just know that sometimes, even though you can't smell it on yourself anymore, other people will still be able to smell it on you. But nevertheless, these are just some quick tips and tips. And of course, I might do a follow-up video on how to increase the longevity of your fragrances, some tricks that I utilize for that as well. But this was just on the application side of things as well. So do you have any more tips? Drop your comment down below. I always love the interaction. And of course, you'll be surprised. There are some people out there that spray on a primer, that like to layer with other fragrances. You know, maybe they use other ancillary products like the body wash or the shampoo just to kind of enhance or augment the smell of their fragrance. Always love the interaction, always love the feedback. Drop your comment down below. And if you took anything of value from today's episode, hit subscribe, hit the bell, and give this video a thumbs up. Thanks again for watching. I love you all. We'll see you tomorrow with a new episode. Bye.